today I am particularly honored to be hosting this panel with three wonderful speakers who are going to give some very high-level approaches to the whole idea of peace and conflict, for that matter, because the two are very intimately related. As Joe said, I recently started a new position in Vietnam as Dean of a College of Arts and Sciences, but I have been in higher education leadership for a number of years, and one of the questions that I have been asking myself for many years is, what do we do as higher education institutions to contribute to a formative environment where young minds that spend 3, 4, 5, 6 years with us come out at the other end being able to contribute to a better future. But in recent years, I've really started asking myself whether we're actually not doing enough, because what I see around me, I don't see the end of conflict. I don't see too many angels around, and I have a lot of concerns. And those concerns are for the future generations, which include my children, and the kind of world that they will inherit. So one of the things that has interested me in recent years is the whole concept of peace education. Peace education is a framework that's been around for a while. It's a fairly broad framework about how to approach the kind of transmission of culture, transmission of knowledge that occurs not only in universities, but in schools, and whether there are ways to do that that are slightly different from what is done traditionally, or at times very different from what is done traditionally, that can actually help make citizens that have traits that will make them value peace over conflict, cooperation over competition, much more than what we do today. So today we're going to talk about memory. Today we are going to talk about mindset, and we are going to talk about vision. And these are the topics that our three speakers will address. And why are these so important? Well, memory, I have already addressed. How our memories are shaped can contribute to what we are. Mindset, education, is how we perceive the world. And depending on how we perceive it, we will act. And our contribution to the world will be based on the knowledge that we have been passed on. And vision is about what we want for the world. And that is a very important question. We have come to understand now that big things such as environment and economy are complex global matters. You can't fix them in one place and not fix them in another because they affect each other. My sense is that peace is just the same. It's a complex and global matter. You can't get a corner of the world being peaceful and leave the rest not to be it and hope that that doesn't affect you. And so I look forward to hearing our three speakers contributing to these three broad topics, and there will be enough time for question and answers later. Thank you.
Yeah, there we go. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your invitation to this wonderful meeting and to discuss about peace education in particular. In this panel, we do live in a time of war, so I don't think I have to remind you. The Russian invasion of Ukraine or the intense bombardment of Gaza, settlement, forced settlement in the West Bank, and southern Lebanon attack are only a number of wars that are taking place right now. You may not have heard much about Mali or Sudan or Congo, where the number of casualties are actually larger than the one we see in Ukraine or Palestine. So this is the severity of the world we live in. Peace education is a field that was immensely popular during the days of the Russo-American Cold War, for the simple reason being that both the Americans and the Russians were confronting each other with a massive arsenal of nuclear stockpiles. And there was a real possibility that well, an outbreak of a nuclear war might actually take place. So the key focus of peace education in the 1960s, 70s, even 80s were about nuclear weapons. And this year being the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there's every good reason for us to turn our eyes to the possible calamities that might take place with the dropping of the bomb. Today, however, I also like to address yet a different issue, and that is about war memories in Japan. I must be quite open with you that I've been part of the peace research network in Japan, strongly opposing the possible use of nuclear weapons, and have been part of the Hiroshima Roundtable that takes place every year. But at the same time, I was slightly frustrated about the way the war is represented in Japan. Hiroshima always appears first in the image of the war. And that is quite understandable. At the same time, you might remember that the number of civilians who died in Japan during the Second World War were far less than the Japanese soldiers who died overseas. And the number of civilians who were killed by Japanese soldiers were, in fact, far larger than the number of Japanese soldiers. In spite of that, most war memories in Japan centered on the suffering of Japanese civilians, and not about Japanese soldiers, not about non-Japanese who were killed by Japanese forces. So there is a paradox here that I want to touch here and call your attention. I will argue that Hiroshima memories was central in the memory of the Second World War in Japan. And that was not the case before 1954. Actually, Hiroshima was one of the major atrocities during the Second World War, along with the bombardment of Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, what have you. And the reason why Hiroshima became central was the nuclear testing at the Bikini Atoll in 1954, which aroused the fear that nuclear weapons might be used again in the war. And that you can see in the popular film of Godzilla, which was shown in 1954. And you can see the monster just stamping around Tokyo in this image here. The Hiroshima discourse became central in the discussion about war in Japan. There was a sudden move from militarism to pacifism, dismantling the holy state. And the people were central as the victim of war. And the Hiroshima story was the one that connects the past experiences of the Second World War to a possibility of yet another nuclear war in the future. And here, Japanese civilians were taken to be the principal victim of war, not the non-Japanese victim of war outside Japan. So there is a combination of universality and limitation. Universality in the sense that, a nuclear holocaust is an existential threat to all of mankind, and that still remains today, as you must have seen in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, or for that matter, the one between India and Pakistan. The horror of nuclear weapons is still very much there. But at the same time, there is particular attention to the Japanese civilians neglecting victim of the invasion of Japanese forces. So that's the paradox of the Hiroshima discourse. There are two other discourses, not the majority discourses, but important one. One is what I have called the Nanjing discourse. Nanjing discourse might be a minority in Japan, but most certainly is a majority outside Japan in the telling of the atrocities of the Second World War. I have only shown the film called Nanking, shown in 2007, but there is a great number of both documentaries and films on the Nanjing massacre, which is by far the best known massacre conducted by the Japanese soldiers in the Chinese theater, although I do have to add that it's not only Nanjing. It's not only Nanjing, and there's a Suchin massacre in Singapore, which I discuss in my book. There are several major massacres of civilians that took place, conducted by Japanese soldiers. Now, I did say that more Japanese soldiers died than Japanese civilians. However, the deaths of Japanese soldiers were not remembered in public memory for the simple reason being that although they may have been forced to go into war theaters, they were also the killers. So they would not serve a symbolic meaning in remembering the war, to the frustration of quite a few Japanese. And there you can see the emergence of the Yasukuni discourse, the Yasukuni shrine being the one that remembers Japanese soldiers. Not only the Second World War, but basically all wars since the Meiji Restoration. And this has become an extremely contentious issue. For the Japanese only talking about Hiroshima was neglecting the victim of Japanese soldiers. And also, the Japanese only talking about the nuclear holocaust was neglecting the sacrifices that were given by Japanese soldiers. The Yasukuni discourse was mainly conservative, if not right-wing, in Japan, but held a tremendous political force, especially all the way up to the Abe administration, if I may. The Nanjing discourse became central in the discourse about the Second World War, mainly in China, but including Southeast Asia and Korea in a different manner, because in Korea this was the memory of colonialism and combined with the war. So we have the Hiroshima discourse, Nanjing discourse, and the Yasukuni discourse. I don't think I have time to go into the details here, but such different memories crush over the interpretation of the war. I would like to show you two films about the nuclear holocaust. One, Oppenheimer, which was shown, I believe, in 2024, and the other, Godzilla -1, 2024. Both very good films, but show very different views. I think Oppenheimer is a good film, but it was an extremely divisive film shown in Japan because it did not show the atrocities on the ground level. No ground zero pictures. And the image of the nuclear holocaust is extremely abstract, the world going up in flames, as you could see. Christopher Nolan shows it very well, but also in a very abstract manner. Godzilla -1 is totally different. This is about particular victim of Godzilla, the Second World War, and the nuclear holocaust, and the what we call the survivor's guilt, that I'm the one who did not die in the war, I should have died, and there is no way that I can compensate on my sins. Oppenheimer shows the image of a nuclear holocaust as seen on a global scale. Godzilla -1 shows a particular case of the Hiroshima discourse that is taking place in Japan. I've been talking too much, so finally, there's this big question that I want to ask you all. Yeah, and this is something that I have been thinking about and teaching about in my classrooms. How we can cross national boundaries in peace education, how we can cross national boundaries when remembering the war, how we can cross national boundaries in seeing the atrocities of war. For war memory is more often a nation-based discourse. The Hiroshima discourse has its own universality, but I'd like to remind you that this was really always about Japanese civilians. And there's something wrong there. But then at the same time, the war discourse in China is almost always about Chinese victim of Japanese aggression without paying much attention to even the Southeast Asian theater. War memory can always be about our victim. And this we can see in the discourse in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, our victim on the Russian side, the Ukrainian side, our victim on the Israeli side, or the Palestinian side, our victim on the Indian side, or the Pakistani side. And unless we can cross this national border, we cannot really discuss about peace education as it should be. And this is a big question that I'd like to ask you all to think about in this wonderful opportunity where it is okay to talk about diversity and globalism. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on the panel. My name is Marie Lall, and I work both at Keio University here in Japan and at UCL, where I'm at the Institute of Education. And I think I was contacted largely because I work in education, but I did think that perhaps the contact was a bit misaligned, because when I was asked to speak about peace education, I said, I know nothing about peace education, I work on conflict. So where Kiichi-san has left off with a lovely description on memories, I'm going to talk about mindset, because education is really about creating mindsets. And in general, I think people tend to think that education is a pathway forward for peace, that people who are educated will be against conflict, that education is a way to reduce conflict. Nothing is further from the truth. Because generally speaking, education is a state-used political tool. And I've spent the last 30 years of my life writing about this. Mostly I focus on India, Pakistan, and Myanmar, but it's true wherever you are. And I've put one quote, and in the next slide we'll just have a few images that you can all read yourselves. But in effect, education is about building, at a national level, a cohesive society. So in the same way that you talk about our victim, we're talking about our national identity, our citizen. And that national identity that is at the basis of citizenship is generally one that is created by elites. So it does shift over time. This is not something which stays constant, but created by elites in order to bring all different people into sort of one common vision of who they are. And that in itself creates antagonistic identities. That's at the basis of both internal and external conflict. And I won't spend a lot of time, but I'm going to talk about 3 case studies that I've worked on. First of all, I'll start with Myanmar. So since the early 2000s, I was active in Myanmar, first under the junta government, then under the reform government under President Thein Sein, and then under Aung San Suu Kyi's led government, the NLD, prior to the coup. Obviously, have not been able to go back since the coup. But the idea, you can see in the middle picture here, there are 3 famous Burmese, Burma, the ethnic group, the majority ethnic group. The reason that the British called Burma, or Myanmar, Burma was because the majority ethnic group is Burma. So Burma, therefore. So you have 3 important kings who figure in all the textbooks, and the national identity that was created in the Burmese, in the wider Myanmar schooling system was one of Burma and Buddhists. But Myanmar is actually made up of many different ethnic groups with many different religions. And so you have a 60-40 breakdown. Approximately 60% tend to be Burmese, Burma, and 40% of different ethnic nationalities. And so that created that first rift. Because obviously if you're Mon, Karen, Shan, Kachin, or one of many 100+ other ethnic groups, that is not your identity, but you were forced through schooling to adopt that identity, to adopt that language. So this created, in effect, 70+ years of internal war, which continue to this day post-coup. Post-coup it's become a little more complicated because now you have actually the Myanmar army, the Tatmadaw, also fighting other Burmese, other Burma, because in taking away the reforms that started in 2010, 2011, and taking that away 10 years later, the young people have staged a counter demonstration and a revolution against that. The interesting thing is now education is again the battlefield, because as my colleague who's sitting here in the audience with you and I are working on, is the young people are trying to use education to change the mindset of people to be against the traditional way of identifying as a Myanmar national and to not think of themselves as just Buddhist and Burma. But they have a long, long, long way to go before that might, in the end, be successful. And it also obviously means a lot of blood on the battlefields. Moving on to the next case study that I've been working on for well over 2.5 decades is Pakistan. So you have here the textbook, image of the textbook, where Pakistan was created as a homeland for Muslims in South Asia when partition happened between India and Pakistan. But there were many minorities. So there were Hindus and Christians still living in Pakistan at the time. And the big debate was, where does religion fit into our national identity? And this debate went on until sometime in the late 1970s. General Zia conducted a coup and said, right, we are a Muslim country, an Islamic country, and actually we are a Sunni Islamic country. So that created big divisions with minorities who were Hindus and Christians, but also with Shias, for example. So what we find is, again, internal conflict between different factions of Islamic faith. And actually this has gone on to now go down even within the Sunni faith. You find that Deobandi will stand against Barelvi or Ali Hadith. And so you'll find that the identity has narrowed and narrowed, and as the national identity defined by Islamic religion has narrowed, more and more conflict has erupted within the country. But Pakistan's education system has also been very anti-India, because in defining itself as being a Muslim country, it has very often defined India as being the enemy. So you can go through the textbooks. Everything I say is based on what happens in classrooms and what happens in textbooks and what happens at universities. And so not long ago, we had a exchange of fire across the border, across the line of control in Kashmir between India and Pakistan. And the narrative between India and Pakistan is one of enemies. Which takes me to my last case study of India, where I spent a large part of my adult life, and where I saw that although India started off as a socialist, secular country, it moved post-economic reforms in the 1990s to a Hindu nationalist country. And this Hindu nationalism is reflected again in the textbooks, particularly sharpened up since the latest national education policy that came out during COVID. But this is not this is not something which happened under Modi. This is something which happened well before, post-1991, the rise of Hindu nationalism, which led to a support base that then elected the BJP, which is headed by today's Prime Minister Modi. And if you look at that discourse, again, identical to what I said about Myanmar and Pakistan, and therefore identical to many other countries as well. Internal division between Hindus and other minorities, particularly Muslims, but also Christians, with differentiated treatment at all levels. And obviously, Pakistan, the enemy. I mean, I just have to point out to the fact that we just had everyone was sitting on tenterhooks saying, will there be an extended war? And these are two nuclear powers. So what I really wanted to say is that education is about national interest, not about global interest. And education creates national identities. It creates mindsets that we set ourselves apart from the other. It's the self and other debate. And as such, I'm not sure how, in the same way that when you remember war, it's our victims, our national identity, our citizens, and then all the others who we have to stand against. I'm not sure how that bridge can be crossed and how that can be changed, but I hope that you will be able to enlighten us on this when we talk about your specialization, which is to look at climate change and how we have to actually come together unless we want to have a big catastrophe in the future. Thank you very much.
Could you please turn to the third page? This one. Thank you very much. I have inherited very much heavy burden from Mary. I cannot explain such a challenging question. And when I received invitation to this panel, I have been considering how I could address, because I'm a climate expert, not a peace expert or peace education expert. And I have been considering these things. And first of all, I consider how climate change could cause international conflict in such way as climate refugees. But I'm not 100% convinced about this discourse. And actually, there is no reference to climate refugee in the IPCC report. But conversely, it is clear that international conflict will exacerbate climate change problems, because that will increase CO2 emissions, and also that will divert your attention from climate change to more imminent threat. But there are some common elements between climate and peace, and both of them are caused by global challenges caused by human beings, and both of them need to be addressed globally. And so long as it is caused by human beings, education matters. But I have been listening to Mary's presentation that education is also, for national identity, and that is not necessarily contributing to crossing national boundary posed by Professor Fujiwara's very difficult questions. And I think this challenging question also applies to climate conflict. And the Umberto at the beginning of this session issued 3 issues: memory, mindset, and vision. And vision in terms of climate mitigation, we have somehow common vision how to address climate change. We're aiming at 1.5 degrees Celsius stabilization since Industrial Revolution. But in order to achieve 1.5 Celsius stabilization pathways, we need to reduce the global CO2 emissions by 9.0% every year from 2023 to 2030, and afterward 7.6% per annum every year from 2030 to 2035. And it is much higher emission reductions compared with 5.5% from 2019 to 2020, when COVID-19 affected all over the world. So if we are going to achieve this magnitude of emission reduction, then we need the overall actions, not only by developed countries, but also all developing countries. Next slide, please. Yeah, sorry. Yes, and this shows the different priorities on 17 SDGs across various countries. And Sweden, Japan, both of them are developed countries, and there we have very much high priority on climate action. But looking at China and India, China is a big emitter in the world, but their priority on climate change issue is 15th out of 17. and Indonesia 9th out of 17 SDGs. So in general, developing countries tend to pay more attention to economic growth or poverty eradication or zero hunger or decent education or decent healthcare and so forth. So we have to say we are not on the same page in terms of our priority on climate mitigation. Then mindset matters because ultimately, in order to achieve climate mitigation, we need to be willing to pay for mitigation cost. And looking at the recently conducted the opinion survey by Japan Trade Union to Japanese workers, they asked, to what extent would you accept cost burdens for working towards carbon neutrality? And surprisingly, more than half of them do not accept the cost increase for tackling climate change. And some of them accept a minor cost increase, say up to 3%, up to 5%. So overall, super majority of the respondents are not willing to pay, which is necessary for climate change mitigation. And looking at the various model analysis, we need to bear the cost of carbon price in developed countries between $140 in 2030 and $180 in 2035, and ultimately $250 by 2050. And if we increase carbon price to $100 per ton CO2, that will increase your utility cost by 28% with just $100 per ton CO2. So if we are going to talk about 150 or 180, then that would be 30% or 40% or something. So looking at this opinion survey, we need to be, we tend to be very, how can I say, pessimistic about willingness to pay in such country as Japan. And actually, Japanese government is on one hand talking about climate mitigation, carbon neutrality by 2050, but they are providing gasoline subsidy on the other hand. So it is completely schizophrenic actions by Japanese government. So that shows how difficult to raise energy cost for general public. And if general public does not accept such policies, then that will fail. And that is quite clear from the outcome of European Parliament election last June. The environmental parties have lost a lot of seats. And in recent German general election, also Green Party lost a lot of seats. So people are not welcoming the policies leading to higher energy expenses. So education matters. So on many issues. First, education about challenges of climate change. So we need to be more aware of the potential risk of the climate change. But at the same time, we need to understand the magnitude of mitigation challenges. So it is easy to say 1.5 degrees Celsius goals, but you should also understand the magnitude, how much you need to reduce emissions. And then, in addition, you need to understand how much you have to pay for achieving such a mitigation reduction. Otherwise, there will be a serious mitigation, awareness gap between ideal pathway and actual willingness to pay. So again, this is the matter of education. But like Mary, the climate change is the biggest, how can I say, negative externality at the global level. So they can only be solved by international collaboration. So in order to do so, we need to cross our national boundary. But I have been, seasoned, observer of climate negotiation in the last 20 years. But what shows is still in the climate negotiation, the national interest matters most. And that tendency is increasing, unfortunately. So, sorry, I could not give the clear answer to Mari's question. So I have further, exacerbated the despair, but that is my summary. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these high-level views of the huge challenges that are involved in thinking about how to make some kind of contribution to improving the kind of nature that has been discussed here and the kind of view of oneself as a people, as a country, as well as the inability or the struggle that we find in terms of cooperating beyond certain borders. We have the great pleasure of having these three panelists here, so I would now like to open up for questions. Please introduce yourself and address the question to one of our panelists as you do so. I'll start from over there, and we then go to...
Thanks the panel for a lovely introduction of peace education in times of conflict. I would like to refer to Professor Marie Lall and tell her that I differentiate between peace education and military education. Because there is an education and knowledge and knowing about other countries and cultures, and there is military education that just, you know, push for wars and disputes and conflicts. So I would like her to refer to Rocket's theory from the 1960s about the closed mind and the open mind, and also to refer to religion as in one hand, it's all religion are talking about peace and their believing and aspiring and so on. But on the other hand, we know that religion may be causing some major disputes. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. Just to be very clear, most countries actually don't have military education. My first example was one of military education, which is Myanmar, but the education system in Pakistan and the education system in India, neither are military education systems. And if you look at textbooks across Asia, Africa, Europe, what is actually, and this is not only textbooks, but if you also go into the classrooms, both at basic education level and higher education level, you will find that in general, identity and creating a national identity is not created to cause conflict, but actually to have harmony within your own society. But that automatically creates a self and other. And there are scores of philosophical works on the self and other. And so this is not about military education going forward towards conflict. In fact, I would even argue that Myanmar's military education was one that aimed to bring a diverse society together and miserably failed. And in many ways, actually, the decisions taken both in India and in Pakistan are come from a similar point of view, which is we have very diverse societies. It is better if everyone has one particular view of who we are. But if you differ from that, then obviously you have the self and other, and that's what creates conflict both domestically and internationally. And so peace education is a completely separate subject because that is a curriculum that tries to talk about how people can come together in a peaceful way. But broadly speaking, your standard education in all schools, be it the global north or the global south, will be about a national identity. And that automatically will create a self and other, and that will lead to conflict. Some of them then become violent, Others are just simmering below the surface. I'm half French. I can tell you about the French education system and the rise of the far right, for example, and how that affects Muslim minorities in France. It is identical to what I view in my 3 study countries, India, Pakistan, and Myanmar. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. My name is Angela from Taiwan in the Philippines. So I am springboarding this question because it was shown earlier, like photos from films. And nowadays, I think those representations are kind of replaced by machine learning, data feeding, and artificial intelligence. So my question is, anyone from the panel may answer. What do we know so far with machine learning, and how can it contribute to making peace education sturdier or firmer, so to speak, highlighting the paradox of the diminishing control of people towards data identity and authority? So basically, how do we combat the resistance of people in accepting the overall idea of peace education? Thank you.
Thank you for a great question, and I'm not sure if my answer would be responding to would be a good response. But I dare say that machine learning, machine-based learning, and artificial intelligence is based on what has been written in text, including what is true or not true. It doesn't really matter. It's like taking a majority opinion poll. Say 70%, 80% of the people are writing X, and then X is included in the outcome that comes from the answers given by the machine. So a machine is not a creation; it's a reflection of who we are. The sad finding, I dare say, is that the majority of texts are not necessarily based on professional, careful fact-finding and research. And it does reflect many simplified ideas about a society, occasionally going along national borderlines. So I do not think an AI is a solution, but AI is a reflection of who we are. I'd like to say one thing about peace education. Anybody who used the word peace education was not really following government guidelines. In the days of the Cold War, peace education was a move that we could see in Europe, Asia, Japan, or the United States, confronting government policy that justified the use of force, including nuclear deterrence. So there was an obvious divisive political issue here, and that certainly applies to Japan. For peace education was more or less supported by the left-leaning teachers' union, and the government disliked that. But we should not simply reduce this to left-right division. For education is not necessarily for the government or for the state. I follow Mary's point that education has been a state tool in fostering national identity. But at the same time, there were always attempts for educators to bring out more knowledge, more insight from the people, whether that accords with the finding of the artificial intelligence, I don't know. But there's some hope, limited hope there. I should stop here.
Fidi Ranawijaya from the University of Erfurt, Germany. My question is for Professor Fujiwara. I really agree, and I'm really mesmerized with your statement about creating a more fair education, fair narratives on education system, especially about who's being the perpetrators of war and who's being the victims, for example. But trying to play a devil's advocate here about Hiroshima, for example, we see that the perpetrators is still celebrated as a prominent member of the Security Council, as they're still being invited to the commemorations or the remembrance of the Hiroshima nuclear war. And also the Oppenheimer is still being celebrated as one of the best-selling movies of all time. And despite of his regrets, he's still being medaled, received a presidential medal from the US government. So it is still, although like we're trying to create like fair representations of peace education, however, like the perpetrators are still being celebrated. But like my question is focused on in Europe. I think Professor Lall mentioned before that in France, they're trying to like make a clear pictures of how like the far right is actually rising in France, for example. And in the Netherlands, it is started to be the education system in higher education, especially trying to create like fair narratives nowadays about like the Dutch atrocities and the colonial history. But it is, I think it's kind of like harder if we talk about the K-12. I mean, the kindergarten to 12 years of educations, since it is actually easier to teach about who's good and bad. But like, how do you think? What is your image towards like more fair narratives in a K-12 education?
My response to your question would be that actually it could be, and it is, worse than how you described. I don't think the use of nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki can be justified. That's my personal view, and it's not only my personal view, but at the same time, there is yet another argument: the use of atomic weapons put an end to the war, put an end to the Japanese invasion, brought about peace. It was necessary, and just don't make any arguments about it. So that argument, the use of nuclear weapons was a force of liberation, it's most certainly easy to justify from the viewpoint of the one who dropped the bomb. I don't think all Americans agree to that point, but there are Americans who argue in that manner. And that goes to a large chunk of European societies as well. Britain, France, these are nuclear powers. And there are many who argue that nuclear weapons is essential for survival. And what is even more alarming is that we see that discourse taking place in China, where nuclear weapons was not central in the discussion about the war, but is now occupying a larger role in national discourse. So things are bad.
I just want to add to this that it's always easier for the victors because they write history. So ultimately, the interpretation we have on the nuclear bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are written by the victors, not by the Japanese. So in that sense, that is the view that is propagated. This is with every conflict. But what I wanted to say to your question with regard to what to do with regard to education from K to 12, I think building on what Kiichi-san said earlier on, it's not about the content. It's about the critical thinking. It's about the teachers or the educators helping young people evaluate what they read and what they see. I think that is probably the most important thing that any educator can do, even if it goes counter to the narrative. So the narrative gets taught. That's in the textbook. That's what's in the exam. That's what people, ultimately speaking, are engaging with. But if a good educator is able to instill questions in the students' minds, then that is a skill for life, and that will have a longer effect with regard to peace rather than conflict, because people who swallow whole ideas about who they are and who the others are and why you can treat other people differently don't have that critical thinking skill. This is more important today now due to social media. And the problem with social media is that any of you who are, I'm not on most of the platforms, I'm not on Instagram or Facebook or any of these things, but those people who are will know that these platforms ultimately feed you back the information within your own bubble, within your own belief system. And the only thing we have which is outside of that bubble and that belief system is the classroom. But then you need the kind of skilled teacher who will be able to instill those questions in your mind. And that's very difficult in under-resourced countries, in schools which have one teacher to, in Myanmar, 80, 100 students sometimes. In India, very often also 50, 60 students, or Pakistan, the same thing, government schooling, and where rote learning, the content of the textbook is the only thing which is going to get you through the exam. And if you don't get through the exam, you don't get into university. If you don't get to university, you're never going to get out of the poverty cycle. So you put critical thinking on the back burner. So the most important thing is the role of the educator, but ultimately speaking, that's not always possible depending on where we are in the world.
Can I just remind us that we have many questions, little time, so keep the questions short and sharp.
Good afternoon. My name is Radovan Škulteti. I come from Slovakia, but I teach in Taiwan. And I'd like to follow on the previous question, and this would go to Professor Fujiwara. I have a friend, her name is Maiko, and she worked in Taiwan. She got cancer, and in spite of all the treatment, she's in relapse now. She had to go back to Hiroshima to get some intense treatment. And so this is not an isolated case. You know that Hiroshima has still a relatively high occurrence of radiation-related cancer. So in connection to what you said, I think that Japanese civilians are still paying the price for the consequences of this war. But at the same time, there's a lot, like a similar thing is happening across East Asia and Southeast Asia and the countries that were occupied by Japan. So there's still a very intense feeling of resentment, as you know, surely now in China, that is being stoked by the recent rise of nationalism. Now, the question is whether, Professor Fujiwara, do you still think that there's a hope for reconciliation? There's still a hope for a sincere apology from Japanese government, and then in terms of education, do you think that there will be textbooks that stop whitewashing this part of history and they will actually teach the children what really happened? Because you will see the effects in one generation, and so if you start teaching them now, like the public opinion will start changing maybe in 20 years from now. And now the times are changing. The tide has been turning, as you wrote in one of your recent articles, that there's been a shift to statist nationalism in Japan, which is like very unified. So do you think there's still a hope for the two great nations of East Asia?
My short answer would be that yes, I do see hope here. I'm not really focusing my work on apologies. With very good reasons, there is demand for apologies. Government officials or politicians can give apologies, make apologies without knowing what happened. And what is more important than apology is to know what happened. And here, the role of education, the role of educators, the role of researchers play a great role by delivering to the public about, the horrors of war, what happened, and what could have been done, and what was not done. And I've been doing that my life, and if there is no hope, then, my life was futile. So, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Ronaldo. I'm from Indonesia. I'm a teacher in senior high school. This question is for Professor Mary Lall. Recently, Indonesia has been undergoing a restructuring of Indonesia's national history. This is true and in line with what you said about the manipulation of history and textbooks, that history can be changed according to political conditions. So, how do we ordinary people detect the correct history? As a teacher, what should we do to address this? Thank you.
Thank you for this very important and extremely difficult question. There were, as you correctly say, history is rewritten according to political circumstances, depending on the views of the elites of the day, which is why the history that was taught in India under the Congress government was completely different from the history that is taught today under the BJP government, because the views are simply different. As an educator, the main thing you can do is educate yourself with reading across the spectrum, even things that you don't agree with. The thing is, whereas my views are very much in India from the Nehruvian pre-1991 view, I do read everything that the Hindu nationalists put out as well, even if I don't agree with it. There are always nuggets of truth in everything. This is why no history book is a complete lie. And this is not only with regard to history, this is across the social sciences. The best thing any educator at school or at university can do is educate themselves, not within their bubble, but across the spectrum. Thank you.
Okay, really quick. Hi, my name is Ebony Jones. I am from Detroit, Michigan in the United States. That is the drawl you all hear in my speaking. Really quick, everything we're talking about is really about power, right? And making money. And I'm thinking about, how do we get governments to see the value in making money from peace? And right, if that is the grounding movement for why decisions are being made, how do we help them to see that there is money in peace? That's all.
To be very frank, peace is good for business. And that was the basic idea of the post-Second World War international order. I doubt if that conviction is shared as it used to be, but nonetheless, I dare say that the majority view, even now, is that peace is good for business, and I also should add that arms industry is not essential for the survival of capitalist economy.
I just want to add to very, very briefly to that, the fact that Mark Rutte he's the NATO Secretary General, came to Tokyo a few weeks ago and spoke at Keio University and was advocating for, let's rearm, let's have big defense industries. Let's have big defense industries here in Japan, Mitsubishi and so on and so forth. Let's please do that across Europe, largely because of the war in Ukraine. Basically, aside from good for business, it's good for, if you don't have to spend that money on tanks, making missiles, making bombs, you can spend that money on education, for example, or food, or whatever other priorities there are. But given the current climate today, I don't see any of the government leaders going in this direction. But I'll give the final wise words to my colleague here.
Yeah, likewise, increased military spending could easily crowd out for the financial aid to developing countries, because in order to address climate change, ultimately, developing countries have to play a role in terms of mitigation and adaptation. But crowding out of the government financial money to military expenses will exacerbate the global readiness for tackling climate change.
That's being cut. Yeah. The UK has just cut its development budget in order to spend more on armaments. I mean, it's exactly that.
I think our time is up. I know that there were more questions in the audience, but that means that you definitely will be at the forum tomorrow so that we can have more questions, more discussion, because clearly we have a lot of work to do, but I think that we agree that it works. It's work that needs to be done. We need to figure out how, and we need to figure out when and where to implement it. I want to thank you all, and I want to thank the panelists for fabulous views and fabulous answers. And I'll give it over to Joe.
Thank you very much, Umberto, for that. That was a great panel, and I think acted as a wonderful provocation for us and to take forward over the next few days. So thank you very much for your interventions. Please, can you adjust your hair? your makeup, etc., for our conference photo.